Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, starting things off for you. So the theme today is rewind, and when I thought back on my high school days and my time in college, I thought about how I approached learning and how I would approach it now, knowing what I know about psychology, if I were to go back. And so that's why I'm going to talk about what I call shattering illusions of competence. And you just heard a little bit about my background, so I guess I can go through this fairly quickly. I was a good student in high school. I earned good grades, but I wouldn't say I was really good at learning. I didn't really know what techniques to use. And I was admitted to Harvard, where I earned my bachelor's degree in psychology. But even then, after attending Harvard, I don't think I ever really learned how to learn most effectively. And now I'm a teacher here at SHSID, and I teach AP and IB psychology, and I see the same sorts of struggles with students. And so what I want to talk about today is how we can overcome some of these struggles. Now the first question to ask is whether my case is unique. Do other students, whether they perform well or perform poorly, do they use inefficient and ineffective study strategies, or are they just doing things better than I was? And we can start to answer that by looking at some survey data. This is from Nate Cornell and Robert Bjork. And they looked at 472 students at UCLA, and they just surveyed them about how they studied. And one question they asked is, would you say you study the way you do because a teacher or teachers taught you to study that way? And 80% of the students said no. Right? And what this means is students are not studying because somebody's teaching them how to study. They're trusting their own intuitions. We can also see when they're asked, when you study, you typically read a textbook, article, other material more than once. We see this is actually the main strategy that students use. They just reread material. So 76% of the students, in this case, said yes. Okay, so this establishes that this is what most students are doing. And next we can ask, well, why is it? Why are they just rereading textbooks and hoping for the best? And this brings us to the biases that influence our learning. So anyone who's taken a psychology course before probably knows one of the most important concepts to learn is that we all have biases. And these influence how we perceive the world and how we behave. So I'd like to look at 3 of these biases that influence our learning. And this is where students are trusting their intuitions about how to study, and yet they shouldn't. And one reason is what's called overconfidence. So this is basically the bias that says, I know this, when, in fact, actually I don't. People tend to be overconfident about the things they think they know. Another bias we have is what's called hindsight bias. This was proposed by Baruch Fishoff in the 1970s. And this is the idea that when you look back, once you know the answer, once you know the outcome, when you look back, you distort your perception and you think, actually, I knew that all along. This is also called the I knew it all along phenomenon. And this happens to students when they look at the answers. We've all heard, they look at the test and say, oh, I knew that, but I got it wrong. So actually, they didn't know it. They just felt like they knew it. So they were suffering from this hindsight bias. And then, more recently, we have what's called foresight bias. And this was proposed by Corayer and Robert Bjork. And this is the idea that when we make predictions about what we've learned, we're actually not very accurate. We think we're going to remember things, and then when the test comes, actually we don't remember them. And I think we all know that this happens to us, and it happens to students. We are studying, we say, oh, this seems really easy, I understand it, I'll know this on the test, and then that's not what happens. Okay, so this brings us to these illusions of competence, where we think we're competent, we think we're prepared for something, and actually we're not. So the first idea is that familiarity is not learning. One of the problems with rereading, re-exposing ourselves to things is they become familiar to us. And we mistake that familiarity with, I've actually learned this. This happens to students. They say, I reread the book, everything seemed clear, I knew the terminology, but then when I had to write about it on the test, I couldn't do it. And then the second illusion of competence we have is we build fluency and understanding of the material, but this is not the same as mastery. So this is the student who says, everything made sense in class, I totally understood, and then I still bombed the test. Right? That's because they were mistaking their fluency with the material with actual mastery. We also see this when students do grouped practice problems. Right? If you do the same thing 10 times in a row, by the 10th time it seems really easy. But when it shows up on the test, you're doing it for the first time again, you have to remember which strategy was I actually using. That's a very different challenge. Okay, so how can we avoid these illusions of competence? We want to avoid things that feel like progress. Familiarity, it feels like we're studying, it feels like we're learning. Right? We do a bunch of the same type of problem in a row, we feel like we're doing well, when in fact, we need to seek out what are called desirable difficulties. This is a great phrase from Elizabeth and Robert Bjork. This is the idea that we have to study in ways that are actually difficult for us. Because we'd rather have that difficulty while we're studying than on the test. So rather than rereading, which is easy, or just rewatching a lecture, we need to actually force ourselves to try to come up with the material. And this brings us to why these illusions persist. You'd think if students did this, they would recognize the problem right away. Oh, I reread the textbook, I still failed the test. Maybe that's not the best strategy. But these illusions persist. So I have an example of a study that shows why this is. This is by Henry Roediger and Jeffrey Karpicki. And what they did was they had students read a passage, and then they had a number of sessions with the passage where they could either restudy the passage, just rereading it, or they would get a blank sheet of paper and test themselves on what they could recall from the passage. So some students were just only allowed to study the passage. For 4 7-minute sessions, they just study. They reread over and over. Another group gets 1 practice test after studying for 3 sessions, and the third group only gets to read the passage 1 time. They have 1 session with the passage, and then they test themselves repeatedly on it. And then they were giving predictions about how they thought they learned, how well they thought they learned the passage, and then they were given a final real test on how much they could remember from the passage. But there were 2 cases where they had the test. Once was after 5 minutes, and once was a week later. So here we can see the results. What we see is why these illusions of competence persist. Because if we look at the right side, if the test is in 5 minutes, then actually cramming and just rereading the passage does work. And they remembered 83% of the material from the passage. And the students who just tested themselves only remembered 71% of the material from the passage. So it looks like cramming works, and it feels like it works. And students predicted that rereading would be the best thing for them. And they're correct, if the test is in 5 minutes. Where they're wrong is when the test is in a week. And that's what we see on the right side. And this is where we have this flipping, where suddenly rereading over and over again actually leads to worse performance a week later, but testing yourself repeatedly leads to better performance. You actually retain that information a week later. And another interesting thing here is the students that reread the passage, they actually read it on average 14.2 times. So they read this passage quite a lot. And the group that only had 1 session with it read it an average of 3.4 times. And you would think if you read a passage 14 times, you'd remember it better than somebody who only read it 3 times. And yet, after a week, that's not what we see. And the other side note here is that the students who read it over and over and over again, they rated the passage as more boring. I think this perfectly encapsulates the problem that students have. We read over and over again, we still do poorly, and then we find the subject to be boring. Okay, so another similar idea is called the spacing effect. I'm not going to go into detail on research on this, but this is basically the idea we've all heard. We need to spread our practice out over time. Right? What's called distributed practice rather than massed practice or cramming. And we were all told this in high school and still tell students today, don't cram. But what we want to do instead is practice retrieving the information just as we're about to forget it. And this is what's referred to by Dan Willingham as information that is not gone, but hard to get to. That's the perfect time you want to practice retrieving it. That's an example of this kind of desirable difficulty. It's much harder than just rereading the book. But as we've seen, rereading the book isn't going to be very helpful. Okay, so students are all told don't cram for tests, but what I like to say is don't be fooled by cramming. Right? Because I was told don't cram in high school, but I thought, yeah, well, the teacher says that, but it always works. I look over things right for it, and there's a couple questions that I get right, and I think all the students here can relate to that. We've all had that experience, but we want long-term retention. We don't want to just pass the test, and then a week later, I don't remember anything. I got good grades, but a week after the test, I didn't recall anything. And then when the midterm or the final came, I had to work so much harder to try to recall that information that had been long since forgotten. And so that's why I want to avoid being fooled by cramming. So we already know this. You all already know this. And in fact, when I look back, I knew this in high school too. But I didn't know it for academics. I knew it for all the other things I did. So when I look at my extracurricular activities with the drama club or with the band, I played music with the marching band and the jazz ensemble. These were my main interests. And when I think about these things, I already knew all these things about learning. So I knew when it came to memorizing music, the best way to see if you'd memorized a piece of music is to play it without looking at the music. that seems obvious. I knew in marching band we had to memorize the show, and so as soon as possible, we stopped reading the music. In concert band, we didn't have to memorize the music, and as a result, it sat on the stand in front of me the whole time, and I never memorized it. 2 months later, I was still reading it. So I knew you have to test yourself, right? You have to put the book away and see what you can do on your own. And then the same is true for performing with the drama club. I had to memorize lines and lyrics, and I need to get off book as soon as possible. That's what performers will say. If you're still reading the script, there's no way you can pay attention to all the other things you need to be doing. And we all know you can't cram for a show. You don't sit down and say, okay, well, the show is tomorrow, I guess I'll start memorizing the script. But we do that for all of our classes. It's really strange. We should apply this lesson. It should be obvious. And lastly, we know this applies to skill development. I knew that you can't cram when it comes to trumpet playing. You can't do all your practicing the day before the concert. It's not going to work. You won't play well. We know you have to spread it out, practice a little bit each day, and over time you get this effect of gaining skills. Okay, so what can we do about this? How can we take those lessons that we actually already know and then apply them to academics and other areas? Okay, so first we need to see retrieval as part of the learning process. It's not just about assessment or being tested. It's actually part of how we learn. When you test yourself, you're also learning the material. And then secondly, remember that more content that can't be remembered is not better. Rushing through to cover more, if you're not going to remember it a week later, is a waste of time. And this is one I still struggle with as a teacher. We all have the temptation. There's 5 minutes left at the end of class. I can talk about one more thing. I can get in one more piece of content because we're always a little behind. Instead of realizing, take that 5 minutes and just see if the students remember what I talked about at the beginning of class. Okay, so here's 3 ways that I try to apply these ideas. And this is not just for teachers or students. Everybody can try to apply these in their own lives whenever you want to learn something. And if you're here, you're probably somebody who's interested in learning. Okay, so one way I do this is through what's called no-stakes testing. And what that means is I test my students frequently, but it doesn't count for anything. There's no grade attached to it. I just see, do you actually remember what I talked about yesterday? So I've started having a quiz at the beginning of every class. 5 questions just from previous class material. Another way I do this is what's called self-quizzing. And this is something that I learned from Catherine Verbelsing, who's the headmistress of the Michaela School in London. And they use this quite a lot. And it's a way to give an assignment for students where all they do is practice retrieving information. So the way to do this is you set out what material needs to be learned. So here I have what's called a knowledge organizer that basically says, to do the evaluation, the analysis that my students eventually want to work to, there are certain things they just need to know. They need to know if they're going to write about genetics. They need to know the difference between monozygotic and dizygotic twins, or what a concordance rate is, or something like that. And so I set aside, you guys have to know this. And then they quiz themselves. So they just take a blank sheet of paper, they write down what terms do I remember from that list, and then do I remember what they actually mean. And the third technique, which is related to this, is what I call the blank slate. So I'm not a blank slateist when it comes to human nature, but when it comes to learning, I think blank slate is a very important idea. And when teachers or schools talk about something like getting tablets for everyone, I think that's a great idea. But the tablets that I have in mind look like this. Right? Students don't need fancy apps, they don't necessarily need something. They just need to see, do I remember what was covered? And of course, at home, when I do this myself, whether I'm learning Chinese characters or reviewing the details of some educational psychology study I might give a talk about, then I have a much more modern version of this, which looks quite fancy. It looks like this. This is really all you need to test your performance, to see, can I actually remember the information? And of course, in the classroom, we can do this with students on a larger scale. And I can have students come up and just write down, what do you remember from this chapter? And by the end, we have a board filled with information. And there's a greater sense of accomplishment here, rather than just rereading the textbook. When you can look and say, look, that's all the stuff I remember. And I can clearly see as a teacher, which parts are missing, which parts did they make errors on. Okay, so one criticism, before I finish here, is where's the creativity? Isn't this just rote memorization, just pure facts, and this is not really the end goal we have in mind for students? But to that I would say, well, we need to have facts. We need ideas and facts in order to be creative. What else can you be creative with? You have to have some starting points. So the more starting points you have, right, the more facts and ideas you have, the more creative connections you can see. If you only know 2 things about psychology, you're probably not going to have some great insight. But if you know 2,000 things, now you can find a pattern in all that data that somebody else hasn't seen before. Or you can write a much more interesting analysis of a study if you can connect it to other ideas you already know. Okay, so I wouldn't be a good advocate for this retrieval practice or testing if I didn't give you guys a test. Don't worry, I won't make you write your answers, but I want you to stop for a minute and rewind. Think back to things I said earlier. Can you remember some of those biases I mentioned earlier in the talk? You've probably already forgotten the name of some of them. Or, what were those 3 things I just said that can help you to overcome this? And just taking a few seconds to pause and try to recall that information will strengthen it. And you're going to hear a number of great speakers today, and you'll probably want to remember some of the things that they said. And the best way to do that is to practice retrieving them. You don't want to have the experience where next week someone says, hey, how was the TED event that you went to? You say, oh, it was great. There was some really good speakers. You say, what did they talk about? And suddenly you can't remember anything. We've all had this happen, right? And that's because we don't practice getting the information out, right? And that's what we need to do to strengthen our learning. So the next slide, I think, is the most important slide in my talk. Here it is here. Right? This is what I hope you remember from this talk, is the importance of just a blank page. Trying to get information out of your mind is an important part of learning it. So in conclusion, many students aren't taught how to study effectively. And this is a shame, because that means they're studying ineffectively. They're trusting their intuitions, and these biases are leading them astray. And that means that they become frustrated, they feel helpless with certain subjects, they feel like they just can't learn it. You know, how many times they read the textbook doesn't matter, they still do poorly. And that means there's lost time and lost opportunities for those students, areas where they could have excelled if they had better strategies. And that prevents them from reaching their fullest potential. So I encourage all of you, starting today with the talks you'll see, and anything else you want to remember in the future, recognize your own biases. Realize that just because you think you know something now doesn't mean you'll remember it in a week. So recognize our biases and try to shadow those illusions of competence. Catch yourself and say, okay, I think I'm going to remember this, but I probably won't. So I need to remind myself in the future. And by doing that and engaging in these deliberate difficulties, doing these hard things, this can help us to all become better learners. Thank you.